Ben ritrovate e ben
Welcome back
ritrovati a
to you all. Welcome back to these lessons on great challenges, global challenges. In our first lesson, we talked about the construction of niches and about the fact that we change the world and the world changes us. We saw many examples and we tried to extend this model. We tried to look at how it can happen during evolution, that our technological abilities, our engineering, our architecture or design skills can change the world to the point that we have to adapt the new world. Most importantly, we saw how these changes are then transferred to our children and future generations. In this second lesson, we will continue this sort of analysis. We will continue along this evolutionary approach to great challenges. But we're going to do something a bit different. We're not going to talk about the general model, but we're going to look at a very specific case. You will see that the example we're going to talk about today has a lot to do with climate change and what we talked before, but it's something that has to do with us very closely. We're going to talk about the pandemic. Why have I chosen the pandemic? Well, first of all, because it's still fresh in our minds with all its dramatic consequences, but most importantly, because I think that we're missing a piece, at least from my point of view as an evolutionist and a philosopher of science, we're missing a piece. Why? And this is very human. It's quite understandable as well. We experience the pandemic day by day. We experienced it with a perspective that looks at the emergency, daily data coming in, possible projections and forecasts. But what we didn't do, and we now have the privilege of doing this exercise together during these lessons, well, what we haven't done is trying to have a broader look, a broader perspective, a broader in space, which to me means looking at the ecology of a phenomenon, but we also need a broader look in time, looking at the past and pandemics in the past. So my first chapter in this lesson starts with a provocative question. Nothing new under the sun? Why am I saying this? Well, on the one hand, because we already saw it during the first lesson, many, they've become less likely, but we had many who were skeptical about climate change. Many had doubts about the fact that climate change had human activities and that global warming had human origins. By the way, we need to be careful about the language that we use. Today, we all talk about climate change. The climate is changing. However, this term has a history behind it. It was originally created by those who were skeptical about climate change. What they said was, let's not talk about global warming. Let's talk about climate change. It sounds more neutral, it's less scary. And after all, climate change has always happened. So, without realizing it, we've adopted the terminology of those who were skeptical about the phenomenon of climate change. It would be more correct to still talk about global warming. This is what is happening. The problem is not that the climate is changing, because it's true, that's always happened, but this time it's changing much more quickly, and it changes because of the activities of one species, and it is following a very specific direction. There's a forcing, there's a very clear direction towards warming, towards heat. Nothing new under the sun, again? Well, on climate change, we've always said that climate change has always existed, but we already saw that something new is happening. We can ask exactly the same question about pandemics. Again, pandemics have always existed. In fact, to be precise, we can say, and we know that for sure, that pandemics have always existed with a very low intensity during the very long time of evolution, starting from the origin of the Homo genus 2.5 million years ago, and I will show you in a minute why we have proof of this. Since the Neolithic, and this is something we already talked about it in the first lesson, we talked about what the Neolithic meant, the ability to domesticate plants and animals. Since then, pandemics have increased very much. At that point, we as human beings, under our own initiative, we learned to coexist with animals. We didn't coexist with before, cattle, swine, sheep, but also birds, etc. And all these animals are a storehouse of viruses which were then passed to us. Measles, cowpox, which then became smallpox. A series of zoonotic diseases, of pandemics that happened over time. So one might say, well, then the pandemic that has just hit us so dramatically, SARS-CoV-2, was inevitable. It is just another chapter in a very long story, and it's consistent with that story. Well, the answer is yes and no, and I will show you why. The answer to this question, however, already tells us something very important on how these global challenges of our time should be faced. I'll take a few steps back, but I will soon zoom in on the topic of today. Why do zoonotic diseases exist? How can bacteria and viruses, by the way, they're very different things. Bacteria and viruses are enemies. They fight against each other. They've been doing so for 2.5 billion years. Well, they have mutation strategies that are very, very clear. We've heard it many times. Viruses, in particular this virus, this one a little bit less, but in general, viruses mutate a lot. They change, they accumulate genetic mutations. They accumulate mutations in their hereditary material. What are mutations? For those who didn't study biology, let's take a look at it. Well, mutations are copy mistakes. They're due to the fact that the genetic material, when the cell duplicates or where there is a reproduction, is copied, is duplicated and transferred. When this duplication happens, mistakes can happen. The same was true when manuscripts in the Middle Ages were copied. The manuscript was copied by hand, and scribes sometimes introduced mistakes, spelling mistakes. This is exactly the same thing. The following scribe would take the copy with the mistake, didn't notice it, and copied it once again. So it's a common mistake that is transferred and passed down. It is a random mistake. It is not due to an environmental influence with a motivation aimed at creating a mutation. It's like a lottery where you have random numbers. Remember this point on randomness because it is very important, and we'll come back to it. So viruses mutate a lot, they're rather unstable in genetic terms, and they accumulate many mutations, which means many potential variants. This is a weapon for pathogens, and it's a great advantage. Why? Because mutating a lot means developing variation. Now, this is a fundamental law of evolution. Remember it. The greater the number of variations, the greater the possibility to change. The greater the diversity of individuals, the better evolution works. Variation is the fuel of any evolutionary change. It is essential. In contrast, when a biological population is too stable, it mutates far too slowly, and it's made of clones, for instance. If all individuals are exactly the same, well, that population will be very vulnerable. It will be weak. It will struggle to react to diseases or environmental changes. So this is a key law of evolution. You need to change and accumulate variations within certain boundaries, because mutations have another problem. They could be bad, they could be detrimental. They can make cells go crazy and turn them into tumor cells, for instance. So mutations can be two-faced. They are ambivalent, like most natural phenomena. Mutations can be very good. They can be the fuel for change, the driver of change, but it can also be bad if it's not kept at bay. Viruses and bacteria, as I explained, mutate a lot. Also because they have a technique that we do not have and that they have developed over billions of years. Let's take a look at it. In order to mutate and evolve, in order to accumulate variations, bacteria, as you can see here, are also able to transfer genetic material directly to each other. They don't just accumulate mutations when there's a duplication, they exchange genetic material. I won't dwell into the details, but if you look at the bottom of the slide, they can even create cytoplasmatic bridges. They exchange genetic material directly, and this increases the opportunity for more variations and more diversity. I can just mention an example. This is the reason why bacteria can easily develop resistance to antibiotics. which is another global challenge, another great challenge of our future. I don't want to be a bearer of bad news, but once again, we have all the data to say and to remind ourselves that this is a great danger. If we are not careful, something very bad might happen. Superbugs might appear. What are superbugs? They are super pathogens, super bacteria that might develop resistance to all known antibiotics. That would be a big problem, because if you catch one of these superbugs in a hospital and there's no antibiotic cocktail that can fight the disease, that can become a huge issue. This is another warning. It's another worry that we who work with the global challenges have. For instance, today we know that there are bacteria, those similar to tuberculosis, for instance, and those of the many strains of tuberculosis that have learned, thanks to these techniques, to become resistant to different antibiotics. This is a huge problem, and it is also a global challenge, an evolutionary challenge. It's the Darwinian evolution seen while it happens. If you abuse antibiotics, if you misuse antibiotics, if you attack a bacterial population and you don't kill all the bacteria quick enough, well, what happens? It means that a small population might develop mutations because of the copy mistakes I was explaining before, and thus they become resistant to antibiotic. That population will be very successful, and the disease will become antibiotic resistant. This is already happening, and this is one of the main reasons why we need to reduce the wrong use of antibiotics. We need to stop using so many antibiotics in intensive animal farming. We need to stop eating food containing all these antibiotics, because we are promoting what is happening here. Bacteria, over evolutionary processes, can get organized in order to resist antibiotics, and they do it much more quickly than we do. Just to give you an idea, human generations last about 25 years on average, so we are slow in learning from evolution, while bacteria evolve every 20 minutes. They duplicate every 20 minutes. Every 20 minutes you have a new population. Their opportunities to evolve are much stronger than ours. So we need to be smart and be careful and act preventively. These are things that we know, while bacteria don't. So horizontal gene transfer is a very important principle. This slide shows that we know, for instance, that thanks to this genetic exchange, this horizontal gene transfer, complex organism came about in nature. We know that our cells, eukaryotic cells, cells with a nucleus and organelles around the nucleus, well, they are cooperatives, in a way, where different organisms have joined forces, they've shared their genome, and they have become more complex organisms. In our cells, for instance, you find mitochondria, the bacteria of cells, those who allow cellular breathing. They have a fundamental role. Well, mitochondria were once bacteria, or archaeobacteria. They were phagocytated inside a bigger cell. They've lost their autonomy. They've started doing something for the host cell, and they have become a collective, a co-op. This joining forces, this mutual acquisition of genome, this fusion, is a mechanism that we know is essential for evolution. And this is the reason why today we know that what we've always called the tree of life. You can see here a sketch from Darwin, a wonderful page where Charles Darwin, a very young Charles Darwin, he'd just come back from his trip around the world. Well, when he realized what evolution was, he drew it. He made a sketch of evolution and drew this tree, the tree of life, with the common ancestor and then all the branches branching out. Bacteria and viruses do exactly the same. They branch out and they diversify. What we've discovered since Darwin is that sometimes these organisms not only evolve by branching out, but sometimes they exchange, they transfer genetic material horizontally. So it's a very intricate tree, it's a very complex tree with many branches, and sometimes you also find side connections, lateral connections. I will show some. Here you can see a metaphorical representation of the molecule of the DNA, the beautiful double helix that we all have in the nuclei of our 30,000 billion cells that we have in our body. Well, about 8% of human DNA is of viral origin. How is that possible? In our DNA? Exactly so. Within our DNA, within the human line of descent, we have cells of viral origins. Why? Well, because some viruses, very different from SARS-CoV-2, this is something that SARS-CoV-2 doesn't have. Some viruses, called retroviruses, follow a technique. What they do is they copy their genetic material and insert it in the host. When these viruses attack sexual cells, egg cells and sperm cells, they insert a copy of their DNA in these cells, which then pass the genetic material down, and that's why in the human line of descent we now have some viral DNA. 8%, by the way, is a lot. It is a significant part of our DNA. It is certainly a part of DNA that has no function, or maybe not. Let's say that in general this is genetic material that comes from the outside, from the attack of a pathogen, which by parasitizing us has inserted it in us. By the way, this tells us a lot about DNA engineering, which is very important. DNA is a wonderful system. It is a machine to store and transfer information which works wonderfully, but it's not a perfect machine. It is a machine where you find many imperfections, many redundancies. Our human DNA is more than 3 billion bases. I'm sure you studied it in school. The DNA is made of nucleobases. We have more than 3 billion. In that sea of nucleobases, only 22,000 genes have a function. Human genes are very, very few, 22,000, floating like phrases, like sentences or paragraphs in an enormous encyclopedia. Most of this encyclopedia is made of sequences that are randomly repeated and have no role, no function. They just create spaces. They work as spaces between games. Sometimes they have regulatory functions. In this jungle of our DNA, in this extremely complicated engineering machine, we also find viral DNA. Why is this interesting? Well, for two reasons. First, because if we look at the tree of life, built by these great scientists, for Doolittle from the University of Dalhousie in Canada, well, we realize that if we look at the base of the tree of life, they're very interconnected. You can see all the arrows that intertwine because there is this constant transfer of genetic material. But then, if we realize that 8% of our DNA is of viral origin, what does that mean? It means that our ancestors in the ancient past, in the remote past, when other human species existed, well, they survived many pandemics. If we put it that way, it is true that pandemics have always existed, and that is true. This great author that you can see here, David Quammen, I already mentioned during lesson 1. He is the author of a masterpiece called Spillover, a book that tells the history of pandemics and the spillovers from virus-bearing animals to human beings. Well, after Spillover, David Quammen wrote another wonderful book called The Tangled Tree, and I recommend this too. And in this book, he tells all about horizontal gene transfer between bacteria, viruses, human beings, and other hosts that are parasitized. So we find out that the tree of life is much more complex, it's much more interconnected horizontally than we might think. In this book, David Quammen explores the danger of antibiotic resistance, and he foresees that we will have problems related to antibiotic resistance. I will show you very soon that when David Quammen makes a forecast, we'd better listen to him, but I will explain why later. This is a beautiful discovery made a few years ago. I mentioned before that we have 8% of viral DNA in our body that has no function, but here comes the surprise. This is true generally speaking, but sometimes evolution is able to surprise us. And this is another very important message that I wanted to share with you. Evolution doesn't think like an engineer that much. Evolution doesn't have a plan, a design in mind. It's not designing a machine or a control. Evolution can't work that way because it never starts from scratch. Evolution always starts from something that already exists. It already starts from material that is there. Evolution makes do with what it has. So it basically uses existing material with its history, with its limitations and its potentials, and reuses it for new purposes. It's a sort of DIY activity. We might say that evolution works like a craftsman rather than engineer. It doesn't plan from scratch. But if you ask a shoemaker to fix a shoe, he can do it by using existing material, adding new pieces. If you ask a craftsman to reuse something for a different function, they can do it. That's what craftspeople do. They make do with what they have. And this is exactly how evolution works. And you can see it with an amazing example. The discovery was made that one of those viral sequences inserted during very ancient pandemics in our DNA during the evolution of mammals was reused for a fundamental function, namely the development of the placenta. In females who start to nurture the birth and development of a new individual, of any species, and of course it's true for humans as well. Most importantly, it is a gene that modulates the immune relationship between mother and baby. You need to prevent the mother's body from rejecting the baby as if it was a foreign body. So this syncytin A modulates this reaction and it develops that wonderful tissue, that wonderful organ, that is the placenta. The placenta that protects but is permeable. It's an evolving and developing membrane. Well, all of this has happened thanks to a viral gene, a gene that originally had no use, had no function, thanks to a gene that was an enemy or came from an enemy in the first place. But then we incorporated it, we kept it, and then we've transformed a risk into an opportunity. We've transformed something that had no use into something that is essential. Now, this is typical of evolution, and we will take a look at some other examples later on. Now, this mechanism is called exaptation in evolution. It's a difficult word, and I'll try and explain it. When you have an adaptation, and the word says it, it's something that becomes apt to carrying out a function, the evolution process creates a function that carries out a function. That's why you call it adaptation. Something becomes apt. Exaptation means that you take something that developed from a previous process and I'm reusing it for a new purpose. This is exaptation. We use the same term in English, in Italian as well. It's basically DIY, evolutionary DIY, using and reusing existing things to do something new. Now, that said, we can take a fresh look at the history of COVID-19, the name of the disease, the history of SARS-CoV-2, the name of the virus, the creature, the invisible creature that is attacking us. So let's try and have a new, a fresh, an evolutionary perspective. Let's look at COVID-19 from the perspective of a great global challenge. Now, this is very important because otherwise, at the end of the pandemic, we won't have understood the most important message. and without learning the lesson. Now, let's take a look at this slide. This is an article with some statements, some reported statements. This is something that we heard many times. The vaccine will increase the number of mutations. It won't stop treatments, and so on and so forth. Now, where is the danger in such a statement? Why is it dangerous? Of course, it's not the journalist's fault. Some of my colleagues said exactly the same things, and some people repeat the same things. Well, what is wrong with it? It is completely wrong. If there is a vaccine that is effective and helps us stop the pandemic and helps us avoid severe symptoms, it's not the vaccine that increases the number of mutations. As I explained before, mutations are random copying mistakes. They are not caused by an external event. They are spontaneous mistakes that just happen. So vaccines do not cause, they do not induce viral mutations. That would be the thought of Lamarck, the idea that the environment directly impacts on the emergence of mutations and directly changes organisms, but this is not the case. Organisms develop mutations and changes, which, based on your environment, sometimes make you survive better and reproduce. That is the Darwinian mechanism. Secondly, viruses accumulate mutations like any other living being, not because they are trying to escape vaccines. Viruses do not think. They do not have strategies. They do not have any intentionality. Viruses don't do things to have an advantage. Viruses are a very simple biological machine in structural terms. It's an RNA filament with a capsule of proteins around it. Very sophisticated proteins, of course, which attack certain cells, but it's nothing more than that. A virus doesn't even have to survive. It just needs to reproduce. Viruses need to enter a cell and create copies of its cells. It then kills the cell explodes, the virus comes out, other cells are colonized, they duplicate, they explode, and that's it. That's all a virus does. It duplicates itself, it makes copies of itself. This is a very important teaching whenever you look at things from an evolutionary perspective. Forget any intentionality, any idea of purpose. There's no intentionality in evolution. Things do not happen for a specific purpose, they happen. There are mechanisms, there are phenomena, but viruses don't have any intentionality. Mutations are not accumulated in order to escape a vaccine. The mechanism is very different, and I will show you why the mechanism needs to be interpreted in a different way. In fact, I'll explain it now. Once again, if we understand what the evolutionary strategy of a virus is, we can be prepared. Next time, we can have a preventive strategy. Right now, nobody is doing it. I don't know whether you have noticed it. We are still thinking about coming out of the pandemic. We're still thinking about vaccines, booster doses, protection, and we're still trying to overcome the pandemic. But that's not enough. This is just the first line of defense. We would need a second line of defense, which would be avoiding the next pandemic or making it more difficult for another pandemic to hit. This is prevention. If I know and understand what's happened this time, I can develop strategies to make sure that it becomes less likely. Impossible, it's not possible, but we can make sure that it becomes less likely for a similar dynamic to emerge. I would like to present an interpretation now. This is another paper that is part of my recommended bibliography. It is in English. It was published on a very important publication, Cell, but this is a review, so don't be scared. There's no technical terms or difficult mathematics. It's a review. It's a popular science article that can be read without any strong scientific knowledge. It's a wonderful article. It was published in September 2020. In the midst of the shift from the first lockdown to the very difficult fall that we lived in 2020. The title is very meaningful. It says, Emerging Pandemic Diseases, How We Got to COVID-19. Well, the title is interesting in itself, How We Got to COVID-19. This article explores the evolution of the virus. How have we got to such a situation? And this is quite interesting. If you look at the summary, you see that the approach is evolutionary. So the article tries to look at what is normal in what's happened this time, but it also looks at what is exceptional. So we go back to the initial question, nothing new under the sun? Have pandemics always existed, or is this one pandemic somehow special? Because if it is the case, it's important to know why. And then secondly, in order to answer this question, you need to apply an ecological analysis. So the key word here is ecology. Some of you will study environmental engineering or will focus on ecology, but this is important for all of you because the engineering of the future will have to look at the ecological aspects of the environments where you will design and plan. So now let's take a look at what an evolutionary analysis entails and an ecological analysis too. First of all, we need to understand what's happened this time. I'll try and help you in preparing the exam, so I'll give you a recap, a summary of the contents of the article. Now, according to the authors, by the way, I forgot to mention the authors are David Morans, a very important American virologist from the NIH, the National Institute of Health, and Anthony Fauci, the very important virologist that I'm sure you saw on television many times next to American presidents. He's the head of the department of the NIH that works on pandemics. Two very important authors. Now, what do they say? They basically say that this has been a perfect storm. What is a perfect storm in evolution and in climate as well? It is a situation where very peculiar conditions emerge, where something sudden and dramatic happens, but it is different from previous cases. It's a perfect storm, something truly exceptional. So yes, this time something exceptional has happened because this is a virus that we didn't know, completely unknown to our immune system. It's a virus that infected humans in a sustained manner, novelty, and all novelties in virological terms are dangerous. Also, it is a virus with an extraordinary Darwinian efficiency in transmitting. It is transmitted very easily, and unfortunately for us, many asymptomatic patients exist. Many people carry the virus without even knowing it, and unfortunately, this is a very effective strategy for the virus. If a virus like Ebola is a terrible virus, and it's an RNA virus, although it's quite different from a coronavirus. Ebola is a terrible virus. It has horrendous consequences. It breaks the cells in the body, but it has a disadvantage because it is immediately recognized. You immediately see when someone has Ebola, and so you immediately identify the virus and you can fence it. You can stop the pandemic or the epidemic, the outbreak, depending on how you can control it. But a virus that doesn't show at all or only after some time, that's very dangerous because it travels silently, it spreads silently. That's why this has been a perfect storm. The previous version, SARS, you might have heard about it. SARS, which exploded at the beginning of this century in Asia too, and it had dramatic consequences. It was about to become a pandemic, but it had a disadvantage because that virus immediately showed symptoms. You immediately knew that someone had SARS and therefore it could be stopped immediately. When SARS happened 10 years ago, many said, well, be careful because if we have a SARS-2 with asymptomatic individuals, that will be a problem because it will be the same virus, but it will be able to travel on planes without showing. It will go around the world. This is something that people said 10 years ago, but we'll come back to this because this pandemic had already been foreseen 10 years ago. So fitness, a lot of Darwinian fitness for this virus, and also a relatively high level of morbidity and mortality, which means that very few people, but still a lot, so a few in percentage terms, have severe symptoms that lead to death. A large majority of people have acceptable average symptoms, and then other people have zero symptoms or very, very mild symptoms. Now, this is a strategy that works very well for the virus, unfortunately for us. This is why this has been a perfect storm. Now, we can recap, and the authors do it. They say, well, pandemics have increased since the Neolithic transition. They call these the earliest steps in man's systemic, widespread manipulation of nature. This is something I already explained. The Neolithic agriculture were the beginning of our manipulation of nature. Perfect words to explain the concept. One of the side effects, and you might remember what we said during lesson 1, one of the side effects is that in that environmental change, we've seen an increase of zoonotic diseases. And you can read a list here: measles or bubonic plague, malaria, avian flu, HIV, Spanish flu as well, an avian flu with 50,000 victims just after World War I. It probably spread in the trenches of World War I, and it happened 1 century ago. It was the last great pandemic before this one. Now, if you stop here, the answer to the original question is yes, nothing new under the sun. It is another historical episode which is consistent with the nature of this mechanism. But this is not really the case. And we come to the least reassuring part of the paper. In the last decade, as you can read here, we've seen unprecedented pandemic explosions. They've increased, and you can see a list here: Ebola, Zika, SARS, then MERS, then COVID-19, and avian flu. If you look at the graphs, they're very similar to what we saw during lesson 1, a long coexistence with pandemics, and then all of a sudden, starting from the 80s, there's a peak in the curve. And the curve peaks to the point that these two authors introduce a new expression: pandemic era. We have entered a pandemic era. What does this mean? You can see it here. It means that we've entered a time when pandemics become more frequent and more violent, more dangerous. I've highlighted these parts which explain what I already mentioned. We must be very careful. And you can read it here, because pathogens mutate more quickly than we do. They transfer genes horizontally, they change, they reuse genetic sequences that already exist. They are creatures evolving very fast, very quickly. The conclusion of the paper is that when there is a struggle, a co-adaptation process, they are always one step ahead. And we are seeing it. They always have the upper hand. We have vaccines, but variants are emerging. We need booster shots, and we will need more booster shots. We will need to modulate vaccines because other variants are emerging, while the pathogen is always one step ahead. This is normal. What is the suggestion of the authors? Well, their suggestion is to draw maps and lists. In this table, you can read a list of all the infectious diseases due to the spillover of pathogens to human beings, with the characteristics, the number of deaths, the names. They're grouped into categories. You can find very rare cases, pandemics due to accidents, because pathogens escaped labs, or you can have intentionally released pathogens, or, as in the case of cowpox, there are some pathogens that we've been able to eradicate thanks to vaccines, and by preventing variations and mutations, we've been able to eradicate some diseases that now only exist in a lab until hopefully this won't ever happen, but if it does emerge again, we will be quicker in finding effective and modulated vaccines. So diseases can be eradicated. I'm not saying they are invincible, not at all. You can see here the main categories of infectious diseases due to pathogens. So newly emerging infectious diseases, the ones like Ebola that re-emerge every now and then, and this is true for anthrax as well. You have deliberately emerging infectious diseases and accidentally emerging infectious diseases. By the way, allow me an aside, because I'm sure that you're thinking about this. What do we know about the artificial or natural origin of this virus? Well, we don't have a definite answer yet because we don't have enough information. But the important thing is that in science, you have to be honest. There's no taboo in science. We will see it in one of our next lessons. With genetic engineering, with a branch of your field, so engineering applied to DNA, we can manipulate viruses, and we do it. Not me, but many researchers in many parts of the world do manipulate viruses. Viruses are brought to labs, they are genetically changed, mutations are introduced. That's not because we want to create monsters in our labs. By manipulating viruses in a lab, researchers hope to be able to anticipate their moves, because they are always one step ahead. But if we study viruses beforehand, and if we are able to simulate their possible mutations, that could help us and give us an advantage. Now, these are controversial research. Not everybody agrees with this kind of research, because it is true that there is a danger, and it is true that labs of genetic engineering develop very dangerous strains which might escape, or an accident might happen. So some say that this research is not really appropriate. There's another problem too. When you do this kind of research, you have to publish your results on scientific publications. By publishing your data, you are basically giving instructions on how to create a dangerous strain, because you are publishing how you've achieved a dangerous strain, which means that everybody will know what mutations in what virus can be very dangerous. So it is quite controversial, let's put it this way. But we cannot deny that this happens. We need to understand whether in the specific case of SARS-CoV-2, something of this kind might have happened. At the moment, the data that we have tell us no, because this virus is very similar to previous viruses. It's the cousin of previous viruses. The evolutionary history is quite clear. We don't know everything about the spillover, but let's say that we have enough elements to think that it is of natural origin. Unless we have all information, we cannot rule out that it might have accidentally escaped a lab. We don't have data so far. Now, this article is very transparent, it's very explicit, so you can read all the different types of infectious diseases. This is a very interesting map. The same categories that we saw before are distributed in the world. So you can see newly emerging diseases, re-emerging diseases, and so on and so forth, and you see the distribution in the world. Now, it's a global phenomenon, as you can see. Many cases in Africa, many cases in North America, many more that you might imagine, and many cases in Asia. But it's not all about Asia. It's not always Asia's fault, because SARS and COVID-19 came from Asia. It is a global phenomenon. It is a global challenge. It is a great challenge. How can we face it? By studying it with scientific research and through preventive science. This is very important. Now, let's recap the main contents of this first part of Lesson 2. We've seen that microbes have had much more time than us to develop evolutionary strategies, and therefore we must be careful. Microbes also have additional weapons. For instance, they transfer genes directly, horizontally. They can mutate and evolve very quickly. Pandemics in general have specific ecological reasons. They don't come out of the blue. They are the result of relationships between us and the environment. And finally, pandemics have always existed. This is true, but we have now entered the pandemic era. This is a technical slide. This is the reason why we don't know everything about the SARS-CoV-2 spillover. In order to spill over, it needs to overcome an adaptational barrier. It's not easy for a virus that's always lived in a pangolin or a bat to adapt to a different organism. There is a problem of adaptation, so it needs to overcome an adaptational barrier. This can happen in many different ways by diversifying in different strains. And you can see, once again, that the secret, the key is diversification. At one point, one of these strains will be able to adapt to the new environment. We, our hosts, are an ecological niche for viruses. Or what might happen instead is that the virus colonizes us, not very successfully, but then it replicates, it diversifies, and at one point, one variant emerges that creates the perfect storm. We don't know yet what's happened, but this is the evolution of a virus. This is how viruses evolve. Variation, co-adaptation to a new host. This is a detail and a point that I'd like to focus on. Over time, a virus doesn't necessarily become more benign. It's been said many times, but it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it does happen, sometimes it doesn't. Why not? Because sometimes variants become more able to transfer or more contagious. We don't know why, but it's not a rule. It's not necessarily true that viruses become more benign over time, and the paper explains very well why. By the way, this is also the reason why, and we will be able to talk about this during our interactive session, but this is the reason why it wasn't very smart to only vaccinate half of the world, the richest part of the world, because while we are vaccinating the richer part of the world, the rest of the world is becoming an amplifier of the virus. The virus continues to circulate, to create copies of itself, so it has more opportunities to develop variants, which is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. So, when we take an antibiotic against a bacterium, you should use it in a global way. And the same is true for vaccines. If you're using a vaccine, you need to use it in a global way in order to avoid possible variants and mutations. We haven't done it, as you know. This is another interesting table taken from the paper. It looks difficult, but it's actually very clear. You can see that there are 3 circles and a sort of triangle, and then an intersection in the middle. The intersection is the disease, the perfect storm. The 3 circles are the conditions that make the perfect storm possible. One is the agent, the virus. There's many. You need to know them. They have a certain biodiversity, but we can't really do much there. There's a lot of surprise. I mean, we can't foresee everything. There's dozens of thousands of pathogens out there. Who knows what possibly lethal pathogens will hit us? But this is the first element, the agent. Then we have the host. That's us. What do hosts do? What are the behaviors of the host? What are the behaviors that can promote the activity of the pathogen? Viruses, for instance, like SARS-CoV-2, love social and mobile species, like bats. And this is quite obvious. Bats live in colonies of millions of individuals. They have cities, like we do, and they fly. They're very mobile. They have all the characteristics to be hit by these viruses. But This is true for us as well. We are 8 billion, we're social, we're mobile, we take intercontinental flights, so we are the perfect host for viruses. And we had forgotten it. Then there's a third circle, the environment, namely ecology, which interacts with the agent and with the host as well. Now, this is the evolutionary, the ecological way to understand the global challenge we are facing. If we only look at it from a medical point of view or from a virological point of view, we don't have the bigger picture. We can't understand the full dynamic of this global challenge. And now we come to the most sensitive, possibly the most important part of this paper, and this is the reason why I have chosen it. We've seen the three circles: the environment, the host, and the agent. We know what the agent does. We know about pathogens. They're dangerous. They mutate. Okay. But what about the other two conditions? Can we do something? Of course we can. The problem is that what we've done so far is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. This is a list contained in the paper of what the two authors call the human ecologic niches. And you can see that we come back to the same point, the construction of an ecologic niche. These are the ecologic niches, the habitats that human beings create and which are perfect for viruses. Water storage practices, how we accumulate water. It can promote the accumulation of eggs, of insects, or rubber tires on ships containing water. This was the main, very trivial cause of the arrival of tiger mosquitoes and tropical mosquitoes to Europe. They've now infested Italy and they bear diseases. Not so much in Italy, luckily, but in other countries they carry Zika, dengue and so on. Deforestation, road building, social conditions, poverty, wars, wet markets. We already mentioned it last time, that the perfect habitats for viruses, intensive farming, climate change. This is the global challenge that we are facing. These are all human practices of human design, or bad human design, bad human planning, which increase the likelihood of pandemics. It's a very complex issue. The engineers of the future, process engineers and product engineers of the future, you will be faced with the equally complex problems. It's very difficult to decide where you should start from in such a complex, multifaceted issue. The final proposal of this paper is very simple, but unfortunately it's been ignored so far. You can read it here. The two authors propose an evolutionarily informed strategy. What does this mean? I explained it before. Vaccines are very important, they get us out of trouble, but it's only the first line of defense. The second line of defense is the list of actions that you can read here, namely safeguarding animal species, reducing deforestation, monitoring zoonotic diseases, analyzing virus-bearing animals, respecting their habitats, stopping the illegal trade of exotic animals, and so on and so forth. Surprisingly, you can see that the conclusion of the paper is the following. Pandemic diseases should be interpreted as an environmental cost. It might sound odd. When you think of environmental costs, you usually think of floods or a prolonged drought or a wildfire. Pandemics, instead, are also an environmental cost. And it should be interpreted as One Health, integrated global health. Because pandemics, it is true, have always existed. Pathogens do their job, but if I help them by creating habitats and ecologic niches that favor them, due to our bad planning and our bad design, then we are promoting pandemics. If a pandemic happens and it hits us bad, like it's happened this time, this is also due to environmental changes and environmental issues. This is the conclusion of the paper. As you can read here, the COVID-19 pandemic is yet another reminder that reminds us how aggressive, dangerous, and unbalanced our interactions are with nature. So, if we want to reduce the possibility for this to happen again, we need to take care of the environment, take care of the relationship we have with nature and the environment, and be smarter once we become aware of the techniques and methods of viruses. After this very detailed analysis, but it is important so that you can study the paper better, well, now we can go back to a broader look, and we'll try and go back to what we said during lesson 1 as well. Now, this is a strange title. The Red Queen is looking for trouble. Well, the Red Queen is a very beautiful evolutionary metaphor invented a few years ago in my field of study. I'll try and explain it soon. Now, this is an editorial published on nature, ecology and evolution. It's a recap of what we've said so far. It says that this pandemic, I know it might sound cynical, but this has been an evolutionary experiment in a way. It is cynical because it's caused many losses. I come from Bergamo myself, so I know exactly how dramatic it's been. But now we need to be cool-headed and look at what's happened. It has been an evolutionary phenomenon, an experiment. During a pandemic, you can study random mutations, you can study genetic variability. We also need to remember that the more viruses around, the more mutations will happen. And so the greater is the possibility that some of the variants randomly are resistant to vaccines, which means the need for new vaccines. It's a constant struggle for co-adaptability between us and the swarms of variants spreading. This virus has even developed the same mutations in multiple lineages in different parts of the world because it is so aggressive. So, in short, COVID-19 has been a history of evolution. Vaccines do not produce mutations. What do vaccines do? They introduce a new selective pressure. If a resistant variant emerged, that would be very successful. This is what happens because while all the other variants are defeated by the vaccine, that one resists, and by resisting, it is very successful. The same that happens with the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It's exactly the same Darwinian mechanism. Now, this is very important to understand. And now I come to the Red Queen. Why the Red Queen? The Red Queen is a character by Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland. It appears in the second book, Through the Looking Glass. At one point, Alice meets the Red Queen again, and the Red Queen is running. She's panting, she's out of breath, she's anxious. Alice asks her, "Why are you running? What is the problem? What is the matter?" The Red Queen answers, "Can't you see? Can't you see that the world around us, the wood around us is moving?" And the Queen says, "If I want to look as if I'm standing still in a world that is moving, then I must run. And if I want to move in a world that is moving itself, I need to run twice as fast." Now, this was written by Lewis Carroll, who was a mathematician, and this is basically a metaphor of the principle of inertia. If I'm in a system that is moving and I don't realize it, and so on and so forth. But this is not interesting for us. However, a colleague of mine, an evolutionist, used this metaphor to talk about evolution. In particular, this is how co-evolution exists. Pathogens are always a step ahead. They're like the wood that is moving, the world that is moving, and we, as hosts, we must run faster and faster to keep the pace. And to keep up with pathogens, if we're smart enough, we need to run faster in order to anticipate them. We are the Red Queen, and we are a Red Queen running to keep up with a world of diseases and pathogens causing these diseases. However, and now you might understand the odd title, if we are a Red Queen, organizing wet markets, cutting down trees, destroying the habitats of animals, then this means that we are a Red Queen looking for trouble, getting ourselves in trouble. We are a Red Queen that must run faster and faster to keep up with the world, and it is also changing the world. We are the ones making the world run faster, and in turn, we have to run faster and faster. So again, it is an evolutionary interpretation. It's called the Red Queen model, which helps us understand why what's happened has happened and how we can get out of it. This is taken from the editorial from Nature, where the Red Queen is mentioned. In other words, the final message is the following: let's be careful, because pathogens are much older. They've been around for billions of years on this planet. They develop more mutations than we do. They only need to do one thing in life, copy of themselves, while we, luckily, do many other things in life. Our lives are much more complicated. Also, viruses love us because we are the perfect host. So we are a Red Queen that is looking for trouble. I don't want to sound too pessimistic. We are a smart Red Queen as well. We have many weapons to run faster. Hygiene, social distancing, scientific and technological research, vaccines, but also, and let's not forget this, we should also protect the environment, respect the life of animals, and let's always keep in mind the concept of One Health, integrated health. Now I can show you once again the picture related to Ebola. I already showed it during lesson 1. I hope you can understand it a bit better. You can see two pictures: a flying fox, a very large bat which stores many viruses. It's a beautiful animal, by the way, but it hosts a whole lot of viruses. It lives in the tropical forest, but flying foxes love fruit. If I devastate the forest next to where flying foxes live, and I have a palm plantation with fruits that flying foxes love, they will come out of the forest, get to the plantation, and do what they do, eat the fruit. These two articles mentioned here maintain that the Ebola outbreaks in Central and Western Africa happened in similar conditions. So you can see that there is a relationship between land management, rainforest management, plantations. You see, it's a process engineering. There's a greater possibility for spillovers and therefore potential Ebola outbreaks. There's a connection. Connections are important. One Health, global challenges. Well, in order to understand them, you need to think in systemic terms, in terms of connections, because then actions are effective if you understand the interconnections that exist. If you look at this terrible, terrible picture, I would show it even before COVID-19. You can see a wet market, and there are many around the world, not just in Asia. And you can see butchered meat, dead animals, living animals, dead animals above the cages of living animals, bodily fluids mixing, servants working with their bare hands, customers who touch everything, no hygiene whatsoever. Now, this is a perfect habitat for a virus. It's quite obvious. However, those wet markets are fueled by a huge demand for food, but also traditional medicines, because Asian traditional medicine, wrongly, without any scientific reason, maintain that some animal parts have therapeutic effects: shark fins, tiger parts, rhino horns, pangolin flakes. Well, they believe that they have therapeutic or even aphrodisiac effects. So these are all examples of bad planning that increase the risk of side effects. Now we have all the elements to understand that when David Quammen in 2012, 7 years before SARS-CoV-2, at the end of his book, wrote the following, he wasn't that wrong. He said, the next big one, the next big pandemic will have the following features. He listed 8. Now read them all, and you see, he got them all right. Zoonotic virus from a wild animal, possibly a bat, amplified into another animal, many asymptomatic individuals, possibly a wet market in China. He got them all right. He wasn't a diviner. He is not someone making prophecies. He's only a man who traveled around the world. He talked to all the virologists who work on the field, and he realized that we were running a risk. This is what science should do. Science should understand, in the case of global challenges, what risks we are running and present a different type of planning and design to reduce those risks. So there is a relationship with the ecology too. Once again, you can see what a scientific prediction is. We already explained it in lesson 1. It's not a prophecy, it's not a divination, it's a scenario. A scientific prediction says, look, if we continue in the same way with these habitats created by humans, we could have the next big one. And this is exactly what's happened. Quammen could not know whether it would happen in 2019, 2021, but he knew that we were running a risk. Many of you as engineers know about seismic risk. I don't know when an earthquake will happen. I don't know when the big one in California will strike, but we know that there's a high risk, and that's more than enough. We can't expect from science to tell us the date, the time when something will happen. It's enough to know from science that a region, because of specific reasons, has a high risk, and that is enough for engineers and architects to build adequately fitted buildings. This is the role of science. It needs to predict risks and scenarios. The rest is politics, the rest is human intelligence, the rest is the ability to think for future generations as well. I would like to close by trying to have an even broader look, and I will use the next 15 minutes for this reason. We've talked about a very specific case, the pandemic. We've gone back to the construction of ecological niches. Now let's try and have an even broader look, because this will help us for lesson 3 and 4 as well. Why should we trust science? Why can we trust science? It might sound like an obvious question. It's not. And I will give you another recommendation for a book that tries to answer this question. It's a very important question after the pandemic. The pandemic has been a shock from all points of view, but it's also been a shock in terms of science communication. It never happened before that scientists appeared on newspapers or went on TV every day of the week. Scientists were not prepared. And especially in the first stages of the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty. Many were swept away by the dynamics of the media, and many mistakes have been made. But apart from this, there is an intrinsic difficulty in understanding science. This is a list of all the difficulties that exist when you, as scientists, engineers, or technicians, will have to interact with an audience, with the public. I think that every polytechnic, every big university should have a course on science communication. Whatever job you will have, in whatever field, you will have to interact with society, with the expectations, the fears, the uncertainties of people, of your audience. You'll have to communicate what you're doing, and it will not be easy at all. Let's take the example of the pandemic. During the pandemic, you have to explain uncertainties and ignorance as well, because you don't know many things. It was a perfect storm caused by an unknown pathogen. Many skills are needed to understand what is happening. Yes, virologists, epidemiologists are necessary, but we also need ecologists. Many disciplines are involved, or those who study evolution. Science cannot be too fast. And this is another difficulty. Science needs its times, its institutional places for a scientific dialogue and discussion. Science must share data inside and outside. It has a social responsibility. Scientific communication must explain what scientific consensus is, which is very, very difficult to do. It's easy to speak on your behalf, but it's much more complicated to explain the existing consensus on a scientific or technical issue. Now, this should be the role of an institution and not of an individual scientist. Also, you need to admit that we don't know some things. It's difficult to do that. Often, when a scientist is asked to give certainties or to make specific forecasts, a scientist or an engineer should just say, we don't know yet. We're trying to understand it, we will let you know. You shouldn't try and answer at all costs, because science is based on a long and burdensome acquisition of data. And then there are many counterintuitive arguments. We already mentioned this when we talked about climate change. And then when you communicate science, you need to explain the scientific method. There's another problem, an additional problem. Many promote anti-science or pseudoscience. They're two different things. Anti-science is a series of positions that criticize science, they're against science. Pseudoscience is even more dangerous, it's even worse, because it's a way to mimic science, to deny it. Fake news often are pseudoscience. They're built effectively because fake news look scientific, however, the contents are anti-scientific. What is the problem in the case of fake news? And unfortunately, you will be faced with fake news as well. It's a rooted and widespread phenomenon. They've always existed, but now with the web, well, the web has become the perfect ecologic niche for fake news. Now you can see the problem here. Fake news are appreciated. We like fake news. They colonize our mind very easily because they're based on tricks that we like. They persuade us. You know, conspiracy theories, seeing conspiracies everywhere, thinking that there are hidden agents, explaining things that we don't understand, self-pity, you know, believing that there's a mainstream information blocking news while we are providing alternative facts because we're solitary heroes. Now, this rhetoric works, and there are other conditions promoting fake news and pseudoscience: economic interests, and mistrusts of institutions, educational fragility, social weaknesses, etc. In our personal, private and professional life, we will be faced with these positions. Let's keep in mind that they're not just the result of ignorance or evil thinking. They are the result of a construction, of a project that can be very dangerous. How can we react to fake news? Let me mention an example. This is a work published on Scientific American. This is an experiment carried out with students. Students were presented with many fake news. It's almost a lab experiment, a social experiment. Different strategies to rebut fake news were compared. The result is quite interesting. If you just debunk fake news, if you explain why a fake piece of news is wrong, you do obtain some effect, but it's very limited. because you might be able to convince those who were already prone to listen to you. But those who believe in fake news become even more convinced. They become even more polarized. So it sort of backfires on you. They become even more convinced that you are telling them something because you have a hidden purpose. You are a representative of the establishment. What is interesting is that if this debunking is accompanied by a technique rebuttal, this is more effective. It's not enough to say that something is fake. You need to explain the tricks behind the construction of the fake news. If you explain the mechanisms behind fake news, the structure of thinking, the advertising, that is more effective. So that can truly become the antidote to, first of all, identify fake news. So this technique rebuttal works much more than debunking alone. It's more convincing. Somehow you can inoculate a vaccine against alternative, against fake news. Now this is very interesting because it shows that as future engineers, understanding the basis of the scientific method is extremely important. It's important to learn the tricks of those who mimic the scientific method, to turn it upside down and to fill it with wrong contents. It's very important. A scientist, an engineer is not only a technician, but someone who knows the scientific method very well. It might sound odd, but this is a way to learn how to communicate better. You will learn how to share better your research and defend your results, your research better, the fruits of your hard work in the lab. Fake news are just one example of a more general problem. So here's the book I recommend. It's just been published in Italian. The author is Naomi Oreskes. She is a very important historian of science. She teaches at Harvard. She's also a scientist. She's a geologist. She worked on geosciences, but she is now an historian of science and she teaches sociology of science. Now, she's published this book and she's very well known for a previous book of hers called Merchants of Doubt. That book showed all the techniques used by science deniers, by those who, for instance, for many years denied the effects of cigarette smoke, or those who denied the existence of acid rains, and later those who started to deny the fact that global warming was caused by human activities. She looked at the strategies and in this book, Merchants of Doubt, she looks at how we can react and rebut this non-scientific approach. Now, in this new book, she presents an idea that you might not agree with. It's called Why We Should Trust Scientists. She says, well, after all, we shouldn't trust scientists just because it gives certainty. And we might agree with this. Certainties, we should look for certainties elsewhere, in philosophy, in metaphysics, in religions. Science is not the right place to look for certainties because science is a method, it's the exercise of skepticism, it's constant review of your results, it's a matter of doubts and ignorance as well. You need to know that you don't know things. A new virus has appeared. In the beginning, we didn't know what to do with it. It took weeks. We studied it genetically. We understood what it was. It took time. We were exposed to uncertainty and ignorance, but that's only normal in science. So that's not the reason why we should trust scientists. And then Naomi Oreskes also says something that you might not like as engineers. She says you shouldn't trust science because it works, because dams are up or because bridges are up. because planes fly. Of course, intuitively, this is the case. I get on a plane because I trust the scientific laws behind a plane flying, and I trust that millions of pieces have been put together. I can't remember how many, but I know that a Boeing 747 contains millions of pieces. I trust it. Of course, I trust the technicians, the engineers, but that's not really the reason why you should trust science. And she makes a counterexample, which is quite interesting. She says, in the past, there were scientific theories that were wrong. For instance, those who thought that a phlogiston existed, the element that generated combustion, or ether. It took Einstein and many others before we understood that it didn't exist. Ether meant as a material, as the fifth element. But those theories worked in a limited manner. So theory, even if it contains mistakes, sometimes can still work. We don't trust science because it works. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all right. Why is Naomi Oreskes saying this? Well, because what she says is very counterintuitive, but it's beautiful, I think. She says that we should trust science because it gets things wrong. We should trust scientists and science because by making mistakes, it continues to review its results. And what happens is that, thanks to skepticism, knowledge increases instead of decreasing. This is social consensus, scientific consensus on corroborated evidence. It is the situation where scientists understand that on a certain scientific data, we are reasonably sure. We don't doubt it anymore, even though there may be some scientists, some heterodox scientists denying it. Scientific consensus is extremely important. We now know beyond any reasonable doubt that there is no cause-effect relationship between vaccines and autism, for instance. Why do we know it? Because we found out that that article was a fraud, we've tested, we've explored all possible connections, and the answer is no. Now, that's scientific consensus. It's no longer discussed, unless new observations emerge, which is very unlikely. Now, that's scientific consensus on the fact that climate is changing and that the average global temperatures are increasing. It's a fact beyond any reasonable doubt. You will always find some engineer, some physician who will deny it. But climatologists and the reference communities have achieved scientific consensus on this. It can be reviewed, it will evolve, it will be updated, but at the moment, this is scientific consensus. This is very important. Naomi Oreskes says, well, at the end of the day, we trust science because it makes mistakes and because it is a constant process of social review of the achieved results. This is fundamental because science is a form of thinking where our ways of reasoning help us to know more and more, but we will never be sure of the end result. Someone new, someone young can always doubt consolidated theories. And if you have the burden of proof, if you have good evidence, if you have good reasoning, good criticism, this is just normal. It happens all the time, and it's only fair that it happens. Science is an adventure of continuous struggle. You find out yourselves. You will write your dissertation, your PhD, and maybe you will do research at a lab. You will be asked over and over again to defend your ideas, to explain what you're doing in front of a commission who might even be somewhat hostile, or they will try and doubt what you're saying. They will try and find the weaknesses in your work. They might say, well, this was already said, this is not convincing, this is only obvious. And you, very quickly, because you won't have much time in scientific conferences, you have 10 minutes and then 5 minutes debate. It's very, very quick. So you have to be able to think quick to then respond. And you can only be quick in responding if you think about your scientific method and you practice and train in communicating your ideas. Don't get offended if someone will try and dismantle your theory. It's just the game of science. There's nothing personal about it. I used to work in the United States, and I remember that I was quite offended the first times, and I'm sure that it will hurt you as well. I would work for a very important research center, and I remember starting my first works. At one point, my boss said, well, next week you will hold a seminar and you will explain your work. I had experts in my field, and sometimes they really destroyed me. They broke me to pieces and broke my ideas to pieces. I tried to respond. I tried to react. They appreciated my answers, and 15 minutes later we were drinking a beer together at the bar, talking about something that was completely different, had nothing to do with it. I realized something very important about the scientific method. It's about debating ideas. It's never personal, it's always about contents. There is antagonism, and this makes sure that knowledge can grow. And maybe after some time, those big experts will tell you that you were right. So this is the beauty, the democratic and formidable beauty of science. My last message for today, and then next time we will look at another case to talk about global challenges and great challenges again. So scientific method and scientific procedures are something that you should be aware of and know as engineers as well. In contrast to those who do pure research, if you build something, well, you also have social responsibility. You have an additional social responsibility. Everybody does. But in your case, that's even more explicit, and you will feel it. So my suggestion is everything that you will study during these introductory courses will try and study, keeping in mind how the scientific method works and how science works. Now, let's recap the contents of lesson number 2. The last part of lesson 2. We saw that in the pandemic era, pathogen hosts and environments create a complex ecology, a triangle of very complicated relationships. We've seen that pandemics should be interpreted as an environmental cost due to the creation of anthropic niches. And we've also seen that an evolutionary approach, like in the case of David Quammen and others, allow us to make precise predictions, even though they are often ignored. For instance, in the case of vaccine, because only the rich part of the world is being vaccinated, other variants will emerge. We've also talked about the Red Queen model, which describes the continuous race between pathogen hosts, organisms, and changing environments. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'll see you again in lesson 3.